Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. You know how this works. We take one juicy source and really get our hands dirty with it. Today, we're diving deep, and I mean deep, into the world of melancholy and depression with Julia Kristeva's book, Black Sun, Depression and Melancholia. It was originally published in 1987.
Kristeva's take is really interesting because she doesn't just look at these emotions from, a clinical standpoint. She weaves in philosophy, religion, art, and literature to really understand the human experience.
I love that. It's like, yeah, we're reading about depression, but it's also like we're experiencing it through these really different lenses. And Kristeva doesn't shy away from some big names either.
Yeah, she doesn't.
I mean, we've got Holbein, Dostoevsky, Doris.
Yeah.
These are not exactly your typical, like, lighthearted dinner party guests.
No, not at all. And you know what's really interesting to me is how these figures each kind of act as a guide, each one helping us understand a different aspect of melancholy. So we'll see it through Holbein's art, kind of feel it through Dostoevsky's search for redemption, and then even hear it in the rawness of Duris's language.
So before we get too deep into those figures, let's start with Kristeva herself. I mean, the book opens with her personal experience with melancholy, which was actually like a big motivator for her to even research the topic. And she even quotes Celine, who said, "What's great in man is that he knows himself to be miserable." What do you make of that?
Well, I think it kind of suggests this innate human curiosity about sadness. It's like we're drawn to explore even the darkest parts of ourselves, even when it's uncomfortable.
That's kind of fascinating, isn't it? It's like, why are we drawn to that?
Yeah.
I mean, I think about like sad music and sad movies.
Oh, absolutely.
That we're kind of, yeah, drawn to. Now, Kristeva also talks about the physiological roots of depression, like how our nervous system actually slows down. But then she goes on to emphasize how important language and symbols are for understanding these emotional states.
Yeah, and I think this contrast is really key. It's like, on one hand, our bodies might be physically failing us, but it's our minds that are trying to make sense of it all. And so Kristeva is kind of pointing out the difference between how depression is talked about in science versus, like, art and literature. Science, they look for objective explanations, but art uses metaphor and emotion to resonate with us, like on a deeper level.
Okay, so we're seeing how complex this is, even from like a biological perspective.
Yeah.
But what about like historically? I was really surprised to learn that the concept of melancholy dates back to ancient Greece.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They believed in the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, each associated with a specific temperament. Melancholy was linked to an excess of black bile, which they thought caused sadness and contemplation.
So basically, if you were feeling a bit down, your doctor would be like, too much black bile.
Yeah, something like that.
That's pretty wild.
It is. But, it was their way of trying to understand, the connection between our physical bodies and our emotional states.
Right, right. I mean, they didn't have the tools that we have today.
Exactly. And that concept of melancholy as a temperament kind of continued to evolve.
Right, because you mentioned Aristotle earlier, and he actually linked melancholy with, like, genius.
He did. Aristotle believed that deep thought and creativity were intertwined with, like, this darker emotional state. So even back then, people recognized that maybe there's a link between deep thinking and sadness. He didn't just see melancholy as a purely negative thing. It was something that could actually fuel creative genius.
It's like this kind of double-edged sword.
Yeah.
And that's a really interesting insight. Something I think for our listeners to kind of consider, like, could embracing those melancholic feelings actually lead to, like, creative breakthroughs for you? But how did this view of melancholy change over time? Did it stay like that?
Well, during the Renaissance, you had figures like Marsilio Ficino who tried to reconcile melancholy with Christian thought, and they saw it as a potential pathway to, like, spiritual insight.
So a bit of a shift from the ancient Greeks who just attributed it to, bodily fluids.
Exactly. But then you have the Protestant Reformation, and there was a huge backlash against melancholy. It was viewed as, like, sinful, something to avoid at all costs.
Wow, that's like a complete 180 from a path to genius and spiritual insight to, like, sinful, no. Yeah, that's a really interesting illustration of how, cultural context can really shape our understanding of these emotions.
Yeah.
So we've got this historical backdrop, but how does Kristeva approach depression from her own, like, psychoanalytic perspective?
She draws heavily on the work of Freud and Carl Abraham, particularly their ideas about mourning and melancholia. They argue that there's this key difference between the two. So in mourning, you grieve a lost person, but in depression, that object of hatred is turned inwards.
So instead of, like, Grieving for somebody else, you're directing that anger and aggression towards yourself.
Precisely. And this is where it gets really interesting because for Kristeva, depression involves this complex relationship with the self. She talks about how the ego is both inflated and deflated at the same time.
That sounds almost paradoxical. How can the ego be both inflated and deflated?
Well, it's inflated because it's totally consumed by its own suffering. The individual is so fixated on their own pain, it's all they can see. But it's also deflated because it feels worthless and incapable.
Oh, wow. It's like this constant push and pull, right? Between feeling like your pain is all consuming, but then also feeling totally insignificant.
Exactly.
So where does the ego fit into this whole concept of like inward hatred?
Well, Kristeva kind of builds on Freud and Abraham's work. She suggests that in depression, a part of the ego identifies with that lost object, this source of hatred. And so the ego ends up attacking itself.
That makes a lot of sense. And it sheds light on why depression can feel so self-destructive. It's like you're turning against yourself.
Exactly.
Now, Kristeva introduces this really fascinating and pretty complex concept, the thing, or what she calls the unnameable. Okay, so now we're getting into the deep stuff. What is this thing all about? How does it relate to depression?
Imagine it as this primal source of anxiety and aggression, something that exists like before language, before even our sense of self. It's this void, this emptiness that we can't fully grasp, but it feels very threatening.
So it's like this nameless dread that's always kind of lurking beneath the surface.
Exactly. And Kristeva believes this thing plays a crucial role in depression. She argues that depressed individuals struggle to separate from this primal source of anxiety, and this leads to feelings of like engulfment and this desire to return to a state of non-being.
Wow. That sounds incredibly overwhelming, like almost like a desire to escape the pain of existence.
You're getting it. And this ties directly into another concept Kristeva explores, the death drive.
Okay, let's unpack that one. What is the death drive, and how does it relate to melancholy?
It's actually a Freudian concept that describes this innate human pull towards self-destruction. And Kristeva sees melancholy as a manifestation of that drive, as this yearning for annihilation, a return to nothingness where the pain stops.
That's a really heavy concept, and it really highlights like the intense and often contradictory nature of these emotions. Like we're driven by a will to live, but also haunted by this pull towards oblivion.
You got it.
So we've covered a lot of ground already. Historical context, Kristeva's like a psychoanalytic perspective, and some pretty challenging concepts like this thing and the death drive. But now I think it's time to dive into Kristeva's exploration of female depression. Specifically, her chapter called The Cannibalistic Solitude.
Yes. This is where things get really interesting because Kristeva explores the specific challenges that women face when dealing with these emotions.
Okay, Cannibalistic Solitude, that's an intense title. What's the connection there?
Well, Kristeva uses cannibalism as this powerful metaphor to show the complex and almost like devouring nature of the mother-daughter relationship. She focuses on the case of Helene.
So we're getting a real-life example here. How does Helene's experience illustrate this idea of cannibalistic solitude?
Helene is trapped in this cycle of yearning for a merging with the mother figure, like almost wanting to be consumed by her. But at the same time, she desires separation and independence.
So it's like that push and pull again, wanting closeness, but also fearing being completely engulfed by that other person.
Exactly. And for Kristeva, this struggle is at the heart of female depression. It's about the difficulty of separating from the primary caregiver while still, like, feeling connected.
It's like finding that balance, right?
Yeah.
Between needing that connection and forging your own independent identity.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense.
Right. And Kristeva's analysis really highlights how these relational dynamics, particularly in the mother-daughter relationship, can contribute to these challenges of female depression.
That's fascinating. It kind of makes me wonder if we can apply this concept of cannibalistic solitude to other relationships too.
Oh, absolutely.
Like it feels like it has broader implications.
It does. It really does.
But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, I think it's time to bring in some art. Kristeva dedicates a whole section to Holbein's painting, The Dead Christ, which we know had a huge impact on Dostoevsky.
Yes. And this is where we start to see how Kristeva uses art to help us understand and even like reframe our views on depression.
So what was it about this painting that resonated so deeply with Dostoevsky?
Dostoevsky was really struck by the realism of Holbein's portrayal of Christ. It was so different from, the traditional idealized images.
Yeah, it's like Holbein wasn't afraid to show the physical reality of death, the decay of the body. And especially for that time period, it was really different.
It was. And there's this tension in the painting between beauty and the starkness of the subject that's really powerful.
Yeah.
Holbein's work forces you to confront your own mortality, to just, acknowledge that death is inevitable.
So even in the face of death, there's a beauty to be found,
Yes, there is.
a kind of haunting power.
A haunting power, yeah. And for Dostoevsky, who had his own struggles with epilepsy and spent time imprisoned, this confrontation with suffering was very personal. So his own experiences with pain and loss likely made him even more sensitive to the power of Holbein's work.
It's almost like art became a way for him to process those difficult emotions, to find meaning in the face of suffering and death.
Exactly. And this theme of finding meaning in suffering is central to Dostoevsky's work.
Okay. Definitely intrigued to see how that plays out. But before we get to Dostoevsky, Kristeva dives into the poetry of Gérard de Nerval, specifically his sonnet El Desdichado, which is packed with symbolism and allusion.
Nerval's poetry is such a great example of how language can reflect the melancholic state. Remember, for Kristeva, language is so important for understanding these emotions, and Nerval uses it to create this world that is beautiful but also very unsettling.
Oh, I'm ready for that unsettling beauty. So who is this Desdichado, this disinherited figure in Nerval's poem? And what's the significance of all that mystical imagery, especially that black sun?
Well, the speaker in the poem, he represents the melancholic consciousness. He calls himself the Prince of Aquitaine, a figure historically associated with loss and exile. So right away, we're in this world of isolation and longing.
Yeah, it's like we're thrust into this melancholic state from the first line.
Yeah.
And then the black sun. I mean, that's such a striking image.
It is. The black sun represents absence. It's like a void, a world drained of light and warmth.
It's like the light has gone out and the speaker is stuck in this perpetual twilight.
Exactly. And then Nerval adds another layer with the sighs of the saint and the cries of the fairy. These figures represent this inner struggle, this tension between, spiritual aspirations and these earthly desires.
So it's like this disinherited prince. He's caught between two worlds, kind of unable to find solace in either.
Exactly. And it's important to remember Nerval himself experienced, bouts of psychosis throughout his life. His poetry becomes a window into that fragmented, dislocated inner world of the melancholic individual.
So it's like he's taking those raw feelings and turning them into art.
Precisely. And this act of transformation, this finding beauty even in darkness, it's a recurring theme as we go on.
Okay, yeah, we're starting to see some patterns here, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we've got Holbein depicting the reality of death. Nerval's poetry is reflecting inner fragmentation. Are you seeing a common thread in how Kristeva is using these figures to explore melancholy?
I think so. Kristeva is showing us how these different forms of creative expression give us unique insights into these really complex emotions. So Holbein, Nerval, even Dostoevsky, as we'll see later, they each use their medium to try and make sense of suffering.
It's like instead of analyzing depression from just like a clinical psychological perspective, she's emphasizing the role of art in helping us understand, even transcend these experiences.
Right.
It's like we're all part of this shared human experience, and by engaging with these different forms, we can tap into something much deeper.
You got it. And this idea of shared humanity, this finding meaning in the face of suffering, that's something we'll see more clearly when we talk about Dostoevsky.
I am eager to get to Dostoevsky, but we need to dive into the world of Marguerite Duras first, whose work is, let me tell you, brutal and breathtaking in its exploration of pain.
Duras, yeah, she takes us right to the edge. What's striking about her work is this unflinching focus on the body, which sets her apart from the other figures we've talked about so far.
It's like she's saying, pain isn't just an abstract concept, it's something that's felt in our flesh.
Exactly. And we'll explore how her writing style reflects this. The minimalism, the repetition, the fragmented sentences, it all evokes this feeling of brokenness.
It's like the language itself is mirroring the disintegration of the self, the
Yeah.
way that suffering can just shatter our sense of wholeness.
Precisely. And Duras doesn't hold back on the themes either. Love, loss, the destructive nature of desire, it's all there. But we'll delve into those complexities in just a bit.
Okay, listeners, stay with us. We'll be right back to explore the raw and powerful world of Marguerite Duras right after this. Welcome back. Before the break, we were about to dive headfirst into the world of Marguerite Duras and her unique take on portraying pain and suffering.
Darash, she really stands out from like the other figures we've talked about. She takes us right to the core of that suffering, almost like through like a physical
Yeah,
experience.
it's like she's challenging this idea that depression is just, in your head. She's bringing the body back into the whole equation.
Yeah, exactly. She's reminding us that pain isn't just like, something we think about. It's something that we feel in our bodies. And you can really see that reflected in her writing style.
Right? Because her style is so distinct. It's minimalist, repetitive,
Mm.
fragmented, almost like it mirrors that kind of fractured inner world that her characters inhabit.
Yeah, you put it well. By stripping away all those extra words, all the flourishes, and focusing on those sensory details, she really forces us as readers to confront the immediacy of pain. It's like the language itself is struggling to contain these huge emotions.
It's almost like she creates this space where the reader can feel those feelings alongside the characters,
Yeah.
to feel that weight of suffering in a way that's, I don't know, it's unsettling, but it's also strangely compelling.
Absolutely. And this is where her exploration of themes, like love and loss and that destructive nature of desire all come into play.
Because those are some pretty heavy themes. It's like she's showing how even our deepest longings, our longings for connection, can also lead to incredible pain and isolation.
Right. She explores like the undercurrents of the human experience, the ways that our desires can lead to both, ecstasy and agony, and she makes us face that messy, contradictory nature of our own hearts.
Thinking back to what we were talking about earlier with the death drive, do you think Duris's work is like a manifestation of that, like this surrender to the allure of oblivion?
Hmm. That's an interesting question. I mean, her work definitely goes deep into despair, but I wouldn't say it's like a complete surrender to self-destruction. There's also this really fierce will to live, to experience, to connect, even while in the middle of all that suffering.
It's like she's showing us the full spectrum of human experience, the light and the dark, the joy and the pain, and it's like she's daring us to embrace all of it.
I think that's a good way to put it. And I think that's why her work can be so valuable to us as readers, as humans grappling with these emotions.
So how do we apply like what we've learned from Duras to our own lives? How can her work help us navigate our own pain and suffering?
Well, for me, Duras highlights how important it is to acknowledge the physicality of pain. It's not just in our heads, it's in our bodies. And sometimes simply recognizing that can be really powerful.
It's like giving yourself permission to feel those sensations, right? To
Yeah.
honor your body's response to that emotional distress.
Exactly. And Duras also reminds us that pain, although it's really hard, it is part of being human. We all encounter it, and by facing it head on, allowing ourselves to actually feel it, we might find a way through it.
That's a powerful message. It's not about avoiding it or pretending it doesn't exist. It's about finding that courage to sit with it, acknowledge it, and then ultimately move forward.
Yeah, and Duras's work, with all its honesty, and rawness, it can serve as a guide for us. She doesn't give us easy answers, but she does show us that it is possible to find meaning and even beauty in some of the darkest places.
Okay, so we've explored melancholy and depression through so many lenses. History, philosophy, art, literature. I mean, we've looked at ancient Greek theories, modern psychoanalysis. We even went deep into some tough concepts like the thing, the death drive. We saw how these emotions are reflected in Holbein's realism, in Nerval's symbolic poetry, even Duras's raw and visceral prose.
That's been quite the journey, hasn't it? We've gone across centuries and disciplines, exploring all these different ways to look at these emotions.
As we head into the final part of this deep dive, what what stands out to you most from all this? What are some things our listeners can really hold on to?
One of the biggest takeaways for me is just how many different ways we can look at melancholy and depression. We've seen how differently these emotions have been understood, how differently they've been expressed across different times and culture.
Right. It reminds us that there's no single depression experience, right?
Yeah.
It's influenced by so many things.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Our individual situations, our cultural backgrounds, our personal histories, it all plays a part. And that brings me to another key point: the power of art and literature to really show us these experiences. Whether it's Holbein's painting, Nerval's poetry, or Duras's prose, these works give us a way to connect with the emotional depths of other people, to find meaning in suffering.
It's like art becomes this bridge between those who suffer and those who want to understand. It helps us see into these dark corners of the human mind, the places that are hard to put into words.
Exactly. And this leads to, I guess, a final thought, maybe even a bit of a provocative one. What if, like Kristeva suggests, there's something inherently human about our fascination with melancholy?
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Are you saying we're actually drawn to sadness like it serves some purpose?
Well, think about it. We seek out art that makes us feel melancholic, we love tragic stories, we even find beauty in expressions of despair. Why is that?
Yeah, it's true. We really do gravitate towards those kinds of stories, those expressions of like pain and longing. But why?
Maybe, just maybe, it's because by confronting those dark emotions, by really looking at the depths of suffering, we gain a greater appreciation for life itself, for how fragile it is, how precious.
It's like by acknowledging that shadow side of things, we can more fully appreciate the light.
Yeah, I think you've got it. And maybe that's why Kristeva ends her book with Duras. Her work, while it can be bleak, it also has these flickers of hope, moments of joy, even in the middle of all that suffering.
It's like a reminder that even when things are really tough, even when language fails us and the world feels like it's falling apart, there's still that spark of humanity in us, that will to live, that will to find meaning.
Exactly. And with that thought, let's move on to the last part of our deep dive. We'll explore how Kristeva sees Dostoevsky as this potential counterpoint to that despair that often comes with melancholy and depression.
All right, so welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into Julia Kristeva's Black Sun. I mean, we've explored melancholy and depression from like so many angles, historical, psychoanalytic, artistic. It's been quite the journey, really.
Yeah.
And now we're getting to Dostoevsky. And you mentioned that Kristeva sees him as like this counterpoint to all the despair that we've been talking about.
It might seem kind of strange to think of Dostoevsky, the guy who wrote those dark and intense novels, as like a beacon of hope. But remember, Kristeva herself, struggled with melancholy, so her analysis is very personal. She sees in Dostoevsky like this way of facing suffering without just giving in to, like nihilism and despair.
So it's not about pretending the pain isn't there. It's about like finding a way to, I don't know, move through it, find meaning on the other side.
Exactly. And this is where Dostoevsky's own life really comes into play. I mean, think about it. He had epilepsy, he was imprisoned in Siberia, the guy knew suffering. But instead of letting those experiences crush him, he used them. He used them to fuel his writing, to explore like the depths of what it means to be human, and ultimately to find that path to redemption.
So how do we see this playing out in his novels?
Take Crime and Punishment, right? One of his most famous, you've got Raskolnikov. He commits this terrible crime, but his way back, his redemption, it comes through suffering. It's by facing his guilt, dealing with the consequences, that he eventually finds forgiveness for himself, and even forgiveness for others.
So suffering, in a way, like becomes this catalyst for change, for transformation.
Yeah, that's a major theme in Dostoevsky, this idea that suffering can actually be a path to something better, to a deeper understanding of ourselves. He's not saying, suffering is great, but he sees its potential to lead us to something bigger.
So instead of just seeing it as like purely negative, Dostoevsky is saying there might be something, I don't know, redemptive about it, about really confronting those emotions head on.
Right. And that's a powerful message, I think, especially now when we live in a culture that often tries to avoid uncomfortable feelings, tries to push them down. Dostoevsky's like, hey, those dark parts, they're part of what makes us human. They can shape us, challenge us, and yeah, help us grow.
It's beautiful the way you put that. Like, we need to accept the whole spectrum of human emotion, the good and the bad, the light and the dark, to really understand ourselves, understand each other.
You said it. And by actually finding meaning in our suffering, by recognizing that it can change us, we might even find a way to get past those feelings of, despair and hopelessness.
Okay, so we've come to the end of our deep dives into Kristeva's Black Sun. We've really gone deep, haven't we? What would you say are the key takeaways? What can our listeners hold on to?
For me, one of the most important things is just recognizing that these are universal emotions. Melancholy, depression, we've seen how they've been around forever across cultures, in art, literature, philosophy. It's like a reminder that, hey, we're not alone in this.
Yeah, that's huge because it's so easy to feel isolated when you're struggling. Knowing that others have been there, that it's part of like the human experience, that could be such a comfort.
Absolutely. And remember, Kristeva, she doesn't just like analyze these things from a clinical viewpoint. She brings in all these perspectives, from ancient Greece to modern psychoanalysis, from paintings to poems. And it creates this much richer understanding of what it means to experience these things.
So she's pushing us to look beyond like the purely medical or psychological explanations.
Right. And to consider the cultural, historical, artistic contexts. And by doing that, we might find new ways to think about our own experiences, find meaning, connect with others who've been through it.
We're like expanding our understanding of what it means to be human, to feel the full range, even when it's hard.
And maybe, by embracing those darker emotions, by looking at that shadow side, we can better appreciate the light.
Finding that balance, that's what it's all about. That's what helps us live a more, authentic life.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Black Sun. It's been a really, really fascinating exploration. I hope everyone listening got something out of it.
It was my pleasure. And to everyone listening, remember, you're not alone in this. Embrace your humanity. And never forget the power of connecting with others, expressing yourself creatively, even especially when you're facing those tough times.